Today, bigger government, bigger Australia, but you don't get a say. Hello again, it's Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, one that is opposed to carrying finance and property news. It's a Friday, and a Friday with Tarek attached. Tarek, great to see you back again. How are you going?
You're not bad yourself, mate.
Yeah, pretty good. There's so much going on. I'm wading through data, and the more that I wade through the data, the more I'm convinced that we're not being told the full story.
Yeah, no, it's interesting that you should mention that because I was actually watching one of your videos the other day, and you were talking about the household cost of living indexes from
Yes.
the ABS
Yes.
and how different they were to your data. And I found that quite striking because I feel like your data is much more representative of the way people are seeing things with their own eyes, rather than from the perspective of government statistics.
Yeah, it is really interesting. And, you've got the confusion about the CPI versus the cost of living index, and those are never actually very well married. But of course, the problem with the ABS ones is that they actually aggregate particular household types with or without mortgages in the same group, which doesn't necessarily give you a very good take, because, of course, not all earning household has a mortgage, and not all older households don't have a mortgage. So, for example, but when you actually look at it bottom up, so I look at it just in terms of the categories of spend that people are actually declaring through the processes I use for my surveys, I get a much higher average rate of inflation across all household groups. And when I actually talk to people through my one-on-one sessions, Tarek, I find exactly the same. People are saying, I don't understand. My costs of living are much, much higher than the official statistics. And I think I've got to say that the averaging that the ABS is using, maybe also some assumptions that they're actually applying, are actually pushing the numbers down. And of course, remember, the CPI excludes the costs of mortgages and those sorts of things, which is a nutty thing anyway.
Yeah, I'm actually curious. So, what sort of rental inflation are you seeing in your data? Because I mean, that's quite a bit, quite a sort of big issue between the ABS and then those of private providers.
Yes, so I'm still seeing the rental inflation a lot stronger than the, say, the Catality's data. Remember that Catality is using the data quoted in the advertised rents, but
Yeah.
it doesn't include the perpetual increases that are being applied to existing renters at the moment. And some of those increases are still in the 10 to 15% range. So I don't think that that is actually flowing through into the publicly available data very well. And of course, the ABS tries to capture some of this, but you got to say, well, how do they know? How do they get the data for the rental sector other than looking at their survey information? Well, how good is their survey information, bearing in mind, of course, that they came out recently and said that they're going to stop releasing some data because they don't trust their surveys. And I have this sort of weird echo of the US BLS disaster with the labour statistics there. Have we got a compass that's working? What can we say about the cost of living? What can we say about the employment or unemployment statistics? How reliable are these? And look, if you start asking that question, then you go around a very important rabbit hole which says, well, hang on a moment. If the Reserve Bank in Australia, or the Federal Reserve in the US, or the Bank of England is trying to make monetary policy decisions with rubbish data, what does that tell you?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree with you, and I think that it's not just the monetary policy side of things either. I mean, as you mentioned, the ABS cancelled, well, not cancelled, postponed, I should say, those various data releases on household income, household spending, and housing costs, and etc., which leaves us basically flying blind with pandemic era data until the middle of 2027. Now, if I was in government and I had an interest in, pursuing the correct policy, then I would be wanting that data, to basically do whatever you have to get it on my desk, because I want to know what's happening with Aussie households.
Yes.
Although I guess if I was in charge, I could just ring you up and just be like, Martin, can you provide me with your data? Because I think, It would be, a whole lot better to have that.
Well, it's quite funny. I've had a number of data requests for the first time from various places, people trying to get a handle on some of this stuff and recognizing that the official information is just really, really patchy. And of course, it's even worse now because the ABS has now started doing their lending statistics every quarter, right?
Yeah.
Which is 1 month delayed. So it's 4 months behind reality. I mean, you can't do anything with that. So we're almost deliberately, I think, flying blind.
I think we're deliberately flying blind, but we're flying blind backwards using the rearview mirror. I think that's really the problem now because, as you say, you've got this enormous lag in the data for housing finance now, and part of the problem is that we've arrived at a point here in Australia where because savings balances have risen so much, the actual cash flow impact of interest rate cuts to households is actually significantly less than it has been in the past. And if you actually count the number of people who are just getting ahead on their mortgage and not reducing the payments, there's a fairly solid argument to be made that rate cuts are actually a negative impact on household cash flow because yes, the households are getting ahead, but the only people who are seeing the benefit of that, aside from the household in terms of their mortgage balance, is the banks. So it's increasingly important to know how the wealth effect and how housing finance is impacting the economy. But if we're looking at that from an even greater lag than we normally are, then that becomes even more problematic, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's actually more worrying than that because, of course, there's also this distribution effect. So when you have your mortgage cohort, not all mortgage holders are actually in the same boat. There are some doing okay, there are others not doing okay. And the other point to make, of course, is that whilst the interest rate might be coming down a little, the average mortgage continues to grow because prices are still chasing higher. And so, again, the distributional aspect, and I think that it must include the aging of the mortgage agreements. So when did people buy? And what I'm seeing in my data is that there are quite a few people who had mortgages some time ago who are certainly well ahead and continuing to pay down their mortgage. But there's a whole tranche of newer homeowners who are still struggling to get into the market, who are leveraged up to the gills and are just struggling to be able to grab that mortgage, but they're not making extra repayments. Now, there's almost no information from the public sphere to show this distribution of different types of households with different, they may have a mortgage, but they are in very different situations. And I could actually take you through the same sort of arguments for those with savings and investments. Again, there are some people who are doing extremely well and are benefiting from the high returns from stock markets and the relatively good returns compared to history on deposits. But there's a whole bunch of other people who have very limited savings. And then you've got a whole bunch of other people who are neither, those with a mortgage nor those with savings, but they're very much the hand to mouth cohort, many of whom are renters. And I just don't think that the story that we're getting from the mainstream media or from the official statistics has the granularity to bring out these differences.
No, it doesn't, and I think that that's really disappointing because you get these. For a start, there's obviously the differences between different age demographics, and that is something that is borne out in some of the ABS data. It's very lagged, unfortunately. Like I believe the latest data that we have on this from the ABS is from 2022, middle of 2022. And that shows that basically young people today have seen no real spending since about 2004. So it's about 18 years of nothing. Now, if you add the CBA data on top of that, which is obviously it's not a perfect analog, it's not entirely apples with apples, but thematically they're similar. And then that looks even worse. But as you say, there are people who are getting ahead in those demographics still, even more so than perhaps was the case, say in this particular instance, 20 years ago. So you've got the issue of, okay, there are some demographics who are going backwards, but then you've also got the fact that there are some in those demographics doing very well, but then there's perhaps much of the rest of the demographic is doing quite badly. So you're just seeing this masking, I think, of the deterioration of outcomes for Australian households. And I think that's just I think it's sad that we're not more seriously examining that, both from a policy perspective and just from a sort of moral human perspective. Because if people out there are doing it tough, I think that they deserve to be heard, and I don't think that that's necessarily happening at the moment.
No, I don't think it is. And, two observations. In my surveys, the proportion of households who are now taking 45 to 55% of their disposable income and putting that directly to their housing, either rentals or mortgages, is as high as I've ever seen it. And in fact, in different locations, a lot of people are in that boat. And the other one is that, did you see the AMP analysis? Shane Oliver recently came out and said, well, the ratio of prices to incomes is now, what, 13.5 times. It's all-time high, and he's calling out the continuing disaster. So, there are a few people wanting to call this out, but unfortunately, it seems to me our politicians have their fingers in their ear going la 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 and talking about, well, we'll just build a few more houses and everything will be fine.
It's honestly kind of, what's the a fair word? Insane. I think that that's actually a fair word. No, I mean, because the thing is, right, like if you look at the situation, we've got the Albanese government coming out recently and saying we're going to increase the international student migration intake for the 2026 calendar year. Yet the Albanese government's own National Housing Supply and Affordability Council came out with a report earlier this year in which they said even if the various forecasts in the budget were to be realized, we're not going to build enough new homes. And that's without even taking into account some of the more challenging to quantify, shall we say, impacts of changing demographics, say, for example, the aging of the population, the rise of single person households, etc. So you've got the government on one hand saying, we're not going to build enough new homes, a federal government agency. And then on the other hand, you've got the federal government saying, oh, well, we're going to increase migration by 25,000 through this particular stream. And the mind just boggles. I mean, is that not morally reprehensible to willfully make a situation worse when you have the ABC reporting that homelessness is, I believe the quote was, the worst in living memory? I think that's rather, just from a position of just pure right and wrong, that's wrong to just impose unnecessary suffering on people.
Oh, big Australia, mate. We just need more people. Let's face it. If we have another million people come in, that'll help the GDP to be a little bit bigger, and that means that, of course, we're doing really well. So, what are you talking about?
It's sad that it's come to this, isn't it? That is literally just the metric that we just say, well, look at all the jobs that we've created. Look at this, look at that, and I mean, I've always thought it was funny, particularly, earlier on in the Albanese government's first term when they said, oh, well, we've created X number of new jobs. It's like, yes, because you do realize that the labor force has never grown by that much before, ever, in nominal terms. So it's not the fact that you're so amazing. It's the fact that you've turned on the government jobs printer, which is something that we'll get to in a little bit of detail later, and you've cranked up immigration to almost double the highest level ever. So, I don't really consider that an achievement myself, but here we are.
It's not a good achievement, I think, is probably the truth. And if you look at New Zealand, or if you look at Canada, where they've got a slightly different set of settings, the house price story narrative and rental narrative is rather different. Just before we get onto your slides, I just want to make one other point. I'm fascinated by the apparent inefficiency of central bankers to do anything useful. And you have seen that the Bank of England yesterday cut the interest rates in the UK by 25 basis points. That's the fifth cut from their peak. They had a bit of a squabble. It was 5-4 ultimately in favour of that reduction, but they had to have two votes because the first one, somebody wanted to drop it twice, and a lot of people didn't want to drop it at all. But they basically said, well, our path for future interest rate cuts is now very, very much slower than we were thinking, right? In the US, of course, the Federal Reserve left rates where they were, despite Trump saying he wanted a 3% cut. And of course, we had the shenanigans with Trump visiting the Fed's building improvement program, that amazing picture of the two of them side by side, and you could feel the radiation there. But the point in the US is the Treasury is now a quasi-Fed, because according to the latest Treasury information, what they're now doing is issuing a lot more short-term bills and buying back longer-term bonds and increasing the money supply, whilst the Fed is reducing the money supply through quantitative tightening. And you think, well, hang on, who's in charge? The White House putting its arms around more and more of the economy. And in Australia, of course, the RBA left rates on hold, surprise. Well, no, not everyone was surprised. But now everyone's saying, of course, the markets are saying, they're going to cut, next time around. But I'm sort of getting to the point where I'm wondering, well, how relevant are reserve banks around the world? It seems to me that do we need them?
Well, I think we've got to the point now where they're no longer really driving the bus in the same way that they used to be. That's part of, the sort of theory of burnout economics, that you have policymakers, political policymakers, I should say, increasingly interfering in spheres of influence where they don't really belong and pushing in the opposite direction. The RBA has been signaled out this cycle for a lot of criticism, but also a lot of praise. And I think that the criticism in terms of them waiting too long to begin the rate rise cycle is definitely well grounded. The RBNZ started in October 2021 and they didn't start till May 2022. So I think that's very much fair. But in terms of the praise, I think they've stuck to their guns to a fair degree, and I think that is sort of, they get the tick for that. But giving them the tick for the labor market staying strong doesn't make any sense, to be completely frank, because it's not them who's done it. It's been the government. It's been, this enormous level of taxpayer-funded jobs growth that has managed to, keep the labor market afloat. And that's had very, very little to do with the RBA. Now, that's not a dig at the RBA, but I just think we need to be fair and just point out exactly who is driving the bus and also is responsible for keeping rates higher than they otherwise would have been. And the ironic thing is, just interesting little statistical tidbit, is if we didn't see that final November rate rise from the RBA, this would have been the longest time ever that rates were at their cycle peak. So I think that that's just worth noting, that is what government screwing with things achieves. It just elongates the cycle. And that's not necessarily a good thing, particularly when you look at the charts of, real wages or real household disposable income per capita, and you just go, well, so we suffered, we extended the cycle, and for what? What exactly have we achieved? It's like, okay, we kept unemployment low, but we tanked living standards in the process. We tanked wages growth in the process. Was that really worth it? And, I'll leave that to the viewers to decide.
But what you're talking about here is the fundamental symptom of burnout economics, right? Where effectively you've got bits of the economy being pulled in two different directions. And the bit that the influence by the RBA is one area, but that's a whole other area which is being influenced by government policy. And in fact, the government policy levers that they've been pulling with flooding the economy with more people, borrowing ever more, and look at the M3 number continuing to rise. So the money supply rises, and money supply drives house prices pretty directly, and of course it also encourages more lending. So the banks are growing. So you can see this contention, and I would argue that the original philosophy of what central banks were intending to do are really being diluted to the point where I question whether that particular function has much relevance in the current environment. And of course, then when you look at Trump and saying, well, we want 3% cuts, please, and we should have lower rates than many other countries. And then, of course, there are applicants for the Fed chair replacement saying, well, of course we should cut rates, So the whole thing has got so politicized as well. We are just going around in ever-decreasing circles, but ordinary people are being cut in the crossfire here. They're being caught. And I don't think that there's enough discussion about the consequences of this burnout economics philosophy that's been imposed on many economies, other than perhaps what you say and what I say and a few other people too. The consequences on real people are just, well, nobody wants to hear it.
No, and I think part of the problem is that you don't see the consequences really being measured. You just see GDP number go up, stock market number go up. Whereas then you look at the actual living standards of real people. Like, I'll give you an interesting one, right? The other day, I was looking at real full-time earnings for blokes in the US because I was looking for something that's sort of not being distorted by things like gender equality, higher female workforce participation, all that sort of stuff. Because obviously that's going to push number up. But if you look at just blokes and compare that over time, men in America today, in real terms, earn roughly as much from their full-time employment as they did in 1979, 46 years ago. And that is an astounding fact. And that's assuming taking the very, very big leap that the CPI has accurately measured inflation over those past 46 years, which I've got a chart on that later in the show, which I don't think it has.
Yeah, absolutely. And we keep saying, well, people have gone backwards over the last decade plus, but not everybody. And the other point there, if you look at the few percent and their growth of wealth and income relative to everybody else, well, they've had a really good time. And, the tech bros are having a wonderful time in the US with what's going on. So again, you've got these distributional things, which I don't think are being discussed sufficiently either, because, at the aggregate level, if you have a small proportion of very, very wealthy people expanding their overall footprint and wealth, et cetera, when you actually aggregate that together, you might have a top line number that looks reasonable. But when you look at the distributional aspects, that's when it really hits.
It does. Moody's actually did a paper on this a few months ago, which was absolutely excellent, top tier stuff. And what they did is they broke down US household consumption by decile. So like the top 10%, next 20%, so on and so forth. And basically, what it showed was that over the last 30 odd years, that everyone except the top 10% had seen their share of overall consumption fall. So we're not talking about it just being Joe Average falling behind. We are talking about like the literal sort of entry-level millionaire class falling behind relative to the billionaire class. So I think that that's a rather sort of just interesting look at just how things are playing out. And I did a little bit of math and I played around with it, the numbers, I converted it into per capita terms. And what I figured was that if you were to somehow magically impose the 1990s distribution of household consumption on the US, the bottom 60% would see their consumption rise by almost a third. And I think that's a rather striking number to just be possible in a society that is ostensibly a democracy, but is moving more and more towards arguably feudal type consumption patterns.
Yeah, well, I remember talking with Michael Hudson, the famous economist, a few years ago, and we were talking about the debt slave, and he was making the point that the debt slave is nothing new. You can go back centuries and you can see it, Greece, Rome, et cetera, But the idea is there that you've got no choice but to, work to be able to actually survive, and in so doing, incurring debt along the way, because effectively the system is not designed to lift you out of that. The system is designed to keep you trapped within it. And if you look at what's happened, that is precisely what's happened over the last 30 years. So more people are trapped in this system where the only thing they can do is to try and work as hard as they possibly can to service the debt or the rental that they've got, to be able to try and survive, to work hard, to be, you got this perpetual motion. And meanwhile, in the feudal system, you never get very far, but the few at the top actually are winners left, right, and centre. And nothing has changed. We're still in this same feudal structure. It's just that we might call it something a bit different because of the new labels and things, but nothing's fundamentally changed.
I think the problem is that feudal systems and feudal type distributions of wealth are the default setting of humanity. I know it sounds horrible, and I know it's perhaps a challenging thing to confront, but if you look at how different shall we say, advanced civilizations distributed wealth, once they reached that sort of level of technological advancement, like you look at even say, for example, South America disconnected from what was going on in Europe or Africa or Asia for basically millennia. And they still had the same type of feudal distribution of wealth and power that was seen in Europe or Africa or Asia. So I think the problem is that it is very much the default setting of humanity. But what we saw perhaps during the late 19th and, probably throughout most of the 20th century was the middle class gaining a degree of leverage, a degree of power that they never really had before in the same in such a explicit way. The mob has always had power. I mean, you had the People's Tribune in Rome over 2,000 years ago, but in terms of actually being able to influence policymakers and outcomes, that's something that's, in such a significant way, that's something that's been more rare. But now we're arguably seeing that evaporate and things can go back to the way they were, in centuries and millennia past. I mean, I guess one wonders how that leverage that we used collectively to achieve the societies that we had or have will persist in the face of further technological advancements like AI and robotics.
Yes, well, we could spend the rest of the show talking about AI and robotics and the next generation. But you've got some wonderful charts, and I guess we should probably switch over and look at those. So
Yeah,
let's give it a go. And we have to say, this is a really good place to start, isn't it? To do it. It ain't a suggestion.
yeah, yeah. Well, I especially like this one. I thought it was rather apt considering what's been going on recently. As usual, the charts will be available at burneteconomics.com. And just a little bit of self promotion here. I've been taking some of the clips from the shows with Martin and I, and just posting like short clips about individual slides, individual conversations, etc., on my YouTube channel. And if you would like to subscribe and come watch some of those shorter clips, in a bite-sized format, that would be very much appreciated. I'll get Martin to place the link in the description below. So without further delay, the first slide. Now, this one has often been a favorite. This is peak New Zealand housing prices since their peak. And as you can see, they're down pretty much across the board, and they've stayed down, with some cities in particular, excuse me, Wellington making further new lows. And I think it's rather interesting just how things have played out in New Zealand. They had that sort of rental crisis and migration driven bounce there. If you could see it particularly there in Auckland in the red, but then it faded and has since basically, continued back towards trending down. So it's a very, very different experience in New Zealand and in Canada to what we're seeing here in Australia.
Yeah, and the big clue here, of course, both in Canada and in New Zealand, was they both have dialed down migration, a few different levers, uh, and they've also done a little bit of tightening, particularly in New Zealand, to lending standards as well with regard to mortgages and investors and those sorts of things. So when you do that, guess what happens? Well, you can see it here on the slide. Prices go down.
Yeah, it's also the fact that while I think most Anglosphere governments have turned to the taxpayer-funded jobs printer over the last couple of years to try and support their economies, to try and, embrace the stupidity that is the government side of Burnett economics, neither New Zealand nor Britain or Canada have had the same windfalls as Australia to have that scope to be able to pursue that. And a large part of that stems, frankly, from the war in Ukraine and commodity prices. And we've had this huge, huge windfall of just skyrocketing revenues from commodities, particularly in states like Queensland and WA, which has helped facilitate this level of government funded employment. But I think it's also worth noting that now, as commodity prices begin to more seriously normalize, that scope is disappearing, and a lot of states are starting to look at their budgets and think, well, we can't afford to do that anymore.
True. And of course, the other point is that the costs of energy in Australia continue to climb. And that's not least because of the gas price, and how the gas price is the marginal price for electricity. And, the recent government subsidies are coming off as well. I'm seeing that in some of my data too. And so we've got this situation where we've got the windfall from the boom in commodities fading slightly, but the costs of energy, which of course goes into everything, continue to climb. And the expectation that I'm seeing is that the cost of energy will continue to climb higher, which means that power prices will go higher, which means that it's a bigger and bigger impost on households as well.
It's a rather uncomfortable question because this is something that gets debated a fair bit on social media. And, I have people saying to me, but people keep saying, the government keeps saying that the prices are going to go down. And I don't think that that's realistically going to happen because we've got aging power infrastructure, we've got the shift to renewables going on. And I think that one of the really not so well understood elements of that is the cost of revamping the infrastructure. Now, when you've got a coal-fired power station that pumps out megawatts and megawatts worth of power, you can run all the transmission lines to one place, and then they can go, come from a location generally towards, in a regional area. They can come towards the cities. They can then spread out and deliver power to where it needs to go. But the problem when you have renewables like wind or solar or really any new form of power is you then need to build the infrastructure for that power. And one of the issues as well with the renewable sides of things is you need to build it. And this is something that they've run into in the UK and they've run into in Spain in particular, is that you need to build the power infrastructure for the peak amount of output that wind turbine or that solar farm is going to put out, rather than what it's going to put out on an average day, which also increases the cost. So there is that particular angle that needs to be considered. And that's something that is, unfortunately rather expensive.
Well, there's an interesting debate going on at the moment because in the UK, they're talking about putting up a whole bunch of new pylons in all sorts of different places. And of course, nobody wants it in their backyard. But now they're talking about offering discounts to electricity for those within 500 yards of the pylon for 10 years. Somewhere between, I don't know, £125 and £225 every 6 months for 10 years. And you think, well, hang on a moment, who's going to pay for that?
Well, that's part of the problem too, Martin, because there is this issue in the UK in particular, because basically they've had issues whereby there's all these wind turbines up in Scotland where, as people who've been to Scotland or are aware of Scotland, it gets quite windy up there. And part of the problem is when they're all operating at full capacity, there actually isn't the power infrastructure to deliver that power all the way down to the most densely populated areas of the UK. And nor sometimes is there the demand for it. So you've got a situation whereby subsidies have built these wind farms, and there isn't actually the infrastructure to deliver that power, which actually ends up meaning that the British government ends up paying the wind turbine owners and the power providers money for nothing. So it just goes to show that when you sort of approach this issue, it needs to be approached in a very, very careful and well considered way, and it's not something that can be done haphazardly. And the infrastructure very much needs to be part of that particular discussion.
Well, without going into too much, but two quick points. The first is that the marginal price of power is actually the most expensive. So when you've actually got base load or whatever it is, everybody gets effectively that amount being paid. And the wind farms get paid that amount to turn off the wind farms if they can't actually take that power and use it because of the infrastructure deficiency in the UK. So that's another reason why power prices are also very high in the UK too. Nobody's actually joined the dots properly to think this through. And, again and again, we see the same problems coming, that it really is a major, major problem, and it's putting a huge impost on the economy overall. Both in Australia and in the UK, the cost of energy as an input cost hits absolutely everything.
Yeah, it's ironic in some ways because I think Australia would be facing some much, much more severe issues with our economy if we had a more a larger, more diversified industrial economy like Britain. But because we don't, ironically, it's not that big of a deal as it is in, say, Britain or Germany or France, which are still, very, very much industrialized economies. Not to the point that they perhaps used to be, but they still are.
Absolutely. Well, let's get on to slide 2. Well, we'll be here for 4 hours and then.
Some viewers might be okay with that, but I don't imagine it the average. Okay, now this is a chart of what the balance of the lower house in for federal parliament. And basically, it shows that Labor has a level of ascendancy not seen, I believe, since shortly after World War II. And that's accounting for the differences in the size of the lower house, which has obviously changed over time. Now, this basically leaves Labor just effectively able to do not quite what they want, but they only need the Greens in the Senate to pass legislation. So there's none of this normal sort of horse trading that we've gotten used to where, you've got to deal with, a whole plethora of people on the crossbench. It's just Labor, just the Greens. If they can figure things out, then that's basically that's basically it. Now, I'm just going to read a passage from an article from the ABC because I think that one of the issues is that with such a huge majority, the pressure is going to be on the Albanese government to actually do something with it from within Labor. Now, I'm just going to read this from an ABC article. Inside the Labor fold, two camps have formed around the government's productivity roundtable, slated for later this month. One camp doubts that a cautious Albanese has much inclination to take on a controversial new policy, and questions whether consensus can be achieved with business and unions appears poles apart on several issues. But the other camp sees a genuine opportunity to achieve something of substance on the budget, the tax system, and productivity. Urgent national concerns that have been rotting for years in the too hard basket. Now, I think that's the problem for Albo going forward. I think that there is going to be elements of Labor who are going to look at this enormous majority, a Labor supporters, wildest dreams realised, and think, are we going to do nothing with this?
Absolutely. And just to remind everybody, that's on 1/3 of the vote, right? That massive majority on 1/3 of the vote. So how representative is it of what people actually were thinking they wanted in Australia? Interesting question.
I think the problem is that Dutton was just such a train wreck because I don't think that, like, if you look at the conditions of the 2022 to 2025 period in a vacuum, they are the stuff of dreams for a self-interested Machiavellian opposition. If you care about the country, they're horrible. But if all you care about is making the government look bad, they're a dream. But instead of promising something vastly different, a solution to the problems that the people face, that didn't really happen. So I think that's really just a huge problem going forward. And I think as well that the coalition has just been hit so hard that they are in absolute disarray. And I mean, an interesting just little fact is the Albanese government needs to see a universal 5% swing against it, which is huge, just to lose majority government. For the coalition to actually win power from even in a minority setting, the swing that they would need to achieve is enormous. Now, not ruling that out because you can't rule anything out in the at times stupidity defined Australian federal politics, but it seems pretty unlikely as things stand today.
Yeah, it is pretty amazing, actually, the story here. And, when I look at it, I'm thinking, well, the old argument, two cheeks of the same bum, was very much, 90% of the policies were the same on either major party. Now we've got one very large bum and one rather small bum, and the little wobbly bum doesn't know quite what to do. But uh, it's not good for democracy, but it's also not good for the country. I don't think. And I wonder whether they will. So this productivity, this is warning, rant ahead. This productivity bun fest that's a week or so ago. Have you noticed how it's now spun into tax reform, and all those things the ACTU saying, well, we should, negative gearing. Productivity and tax reform is sort of connected, but they're not the same. And I worry that they're going to spin off and go into some of the old haunts rather than the more fundamental question of real productivity improvement. But it'll be a talk fest. Nothing much will come out of it, in my view.
Well, I think the problem is that we have a situation where, just in general, and it's for Australian federal politics, where, and admittedly, the media plays a role in this, where by the time a government is elected, they have spent so much time ruling things out that they've effectively tied themselves in a policy straitjacket where they can't really do all that much without breaking, breaking their word. And that's something, that we've seen with the productivity roundtable where Albo's ruling this out and, oh, we're not going to touch tax, we're not going to touch this, we're not going to touch that. And it's like, well, if you're not going to touch anything, how can you affect change? So I think that, we've effectively got politicians who and vested interests who just have our politicians tying themselves in knots and just basically just committing to accomplishing nothing. And while that may be fine if you're a happy vested interest, if you're just a regular Australian hoping for a better deal, well, I think you're out of luck, unfortunately.
Well, talking about tying in knots, the UK, of course, the UK government before the last election said, well, we're not going to lift VAT, which is GST. We're not going to actually change the tax on working people, and the national insurance, which is another big cost on UK households, is also not going to change. So they basically locked out those three big levers of tax. What that means is that they're now struggling because the costs of government are actually rising, the cost of debt's rising. And so they've sort of nibbled around the edge and trying to find, other small levers, and they hit businesses on the tax side last time around. And now there's a significant speculation they're going to have to break that commitment that they gave before the last election, because they're about £40 billion short of where they need to be over the end of the period. And they've got these sort of artificial rules that they've put in place to sort of control what they do. And it's like, you can't make this stuff up. As you say, you end up sort of not committing to anything and promising you're not going to do this. So it becomes a completely negative story rather than a positive story. And you end up being completely hands tied behind your back, against the wall, no chance of doing anything. And sometimes that's one of the reasons why politicians don't seem to make much difference. They sort of just don't have any ability. And then the vested interests, as you say, just pick this up and just run with it and say, well, we'll be fine then. And again, I'm seeing the same thing with the productivity discussion. The vested interests are all out there with their wonderful ideas, and it's a mess.
It's times like this I think about South Korea of all places because they've got like one of the basically in terms of like a major country that's actually bigger than a few million people, they've got the most deterioration in their birth rate on the face of the planet.
Yes,
and they're basically within it. I mean, the projections say that within a few centuries they're basically going to cease to exist. Now, personally, I don't particularly subscribe to that because I think there'll always be those groups with people who do end up having children. So, but in terms of like a nation, yeah, they will basically go quietly into the night for the most part. But instead of the vested interest just thinking, hey, what's the point of ruling over effectively, a country in demographic ashes and thinking maybe I should do something different. Maybe I should have some patriotism and, have some thought about my nation having a future. They just turn around and they just keep pressing the same crap. And it's the same, if they've got exactly the same problem. They don't want to see a crash in property prices. They don't want to see, a strong rise in wages and living standards for people because that would cost too much and that would make them uncompetitive. So there's just all these issues that just go unaddressed. I mean, there's even, say in Korea in particular, there's issues of, there's social problems. There's, there's the issues with a patriarchal society. There's all these different issues that are major. Yet instead of addressing them or even attempting to address them in a far more serious way, they just let it fester. And I think that's why, when people say, "Oh, how do you feel about, like the government or everything, moving towards addressing Australia's issues?" I just look at them and I say, "Well, we haven't had much luck elsewhere so far."
No, exactly right. I have to say that around the world we have mirroring issues, and you wonder about the strength of democracy and the willingness of democracy to actually do the hard things that need to be done to be able to actually benefit. But okay, we've raised this on several occasions. What is the purpose of society and what is the purpose of the economy? And it's not necessarily just to make a few people even richer. It should be, in my mind at least, to help lift all the boats and to help people to make steps forward. But all the metrics say we're actually going backwards, and that's true pretty much in all of those economies.
Yeah, unfortunately so. On to the next one. Well, now this is an interesting one. This is Australian government day-to-day spending as a proportion of GDP. Now, there's a few qualifiers that I need to add to this, just so we fully understand what we're looking at. This isn't federal government. This is all government across. So this is state, federal, local. And I've also chosen day-to-day spending for a very specific reason because some governments in the past invested, particularly the Hawke and Keating governments, invested very heavily in infrastructure and various government works projects, which can distort government as a proportion of GDP higher. That's why I've chosen day-to-day spending because it shows, well, just what the everyday cost of doing business is. And as you can see, compared with even the middle of last decade, so 10 years ago, it sat around somewhere between 18 and 19% of GDP. And today we're up at 23% of GDP. So the question is can this be sustained? And is this having a deleterious effect on the economy? And I think the answer is unfortunately no, it can't be sustained. And yes, it is having a deleterious effect on the economy.
Two quick points there. The first is, of course, the day-to-day spending will exclude all of those off-balance sheet items, of which there are multitudes compared with where there used to be, because that was a way of hiding spending. And secondly, the cost of debt is a lot higher than it was. So if you think about the consequences of this with regards to the debt and the servicing of the debt, that means that a greater proportion of government spending has to actually go on paying the high level of debt. So it becomes an increasingly less powerful in terms of outcomes. Just lifting spending means you actually spend more of it servicing the debt. And are they actually good at spending money in the right areas? Sorry, and things like that. You got to say, has government proven its worth to spend more for the benefit of everybody? Not sure.
I think that's the thing. I think if we were sitting here having this conversation and our schools were of the same quality as they are in Finland, and we had a fantastic medical system where you didn't have, you know, like just recently, you had a 6-year old girl die because because of an of arguably the speculation is as a result of an overstretched medical system. And if that wasn't the case, if we had, this fantastic system, this fantastic, you know, government services and stuff like that, then I can understand spending more. And I'm not ideologically opposed to spending more if we are getting value for money and we are improving things. But I think that a lot of people will look around this country, they'll look at their local schools, they'll look at their local hospitals, their roads, and they'll think, what am I paying for? Why am I paying so much more? Why am I paying more tax for things to get worse? And I think that's going to be an increasingly challenging thing that governments in Australia in general are going to need to confront going forward because a lot of people are getting, I mean, you look at the tax take as the income tax take as a proportion of GDP. You look at all these different things of people paying more. And okay, I personally, I'm fine with paying tax. I'm fine with, being part of a society of putting in, you put something in, you get something out. Fine. But when you're seeing things deteriorate, when you're seeing unnecessary suffering, unnecessary deaths, it becomes harder and harder to reconcile.
Or particularly when the priorities of government spending don't necessarily align very well to the interests of ordinary people, which is what we're seeing.
Exactly. And I think the problem is that I feel like the UK has gone down this road. The UK went down the road after the financial crisis of government getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and that playing a role supporting the economy, and it did. But the problem is that it has limits.
Mm.
And the UK is seeing those limits a lot earlier than we are because they don't have the magical resources machine dropping money out of the sky onto the all the good girls and boys at Treasury. So I think that don't get me wrong, there's still time for the idiocy to persist, but I just don't think it's a viable strategy in the long term.
No, and you've got to ask, is bigger government better? Well, it depends. It depends precisely on what that bigger government is doing. If it's investing good public money into things that actually are going to help future prosperity, and lay the foundation for growth, etc. Yes, it's worth doing. But if it's actually on projects that are, well, stupid projects, or projects that are actually highly inefficient or inappropriate, which a lot of it is, then you got to say, well, more government ain't necessarily better. So it does depend on the quality of the programs, and I think also very importantly on the quality of the management of those programs. And what I would hope some of the discussion at the Productivity Commission would be about how well those projects are actually delivering against the objectives that were set. And certainly in the UK, I look at some of the rising costs of the nuclear program, that the nuclear reactor program, going through the roof. The rising costs of the high-speed rail network, which has been more and more truncated because they're trying to sort of fit it within a budget that's impossible to fit. Big projects quite often get blown out of the water. And again, I come back to AUKUS. AUKUS is the biggest example of probably spending that doesn't make a lot of sense. And there's no guarantee we're going to get anything in the way of subs at the end of it. So you got to question whether this big program of spending, poorly managed spending, makes any sense.
It's quite bewildering in some ways, just the fact that it's not that government can't do the job. Like you look back to the 40s, 50s, 60s, the mass creation of public housing, the huge rise in home ownership. They were very successful with their projects, very successful with building, mass infrastructure, the infrastructure that still powers and helps to feed Australia to this day. But somewhere along the way, we've gone wrong. And I think that we really need to assess that both as an electorate, as a society, but also I think that the politicians need to look at that, and rather than just it just being about power and having helping out your mates, it should be about building for the future, for the like the old proverb, planting a tree knowing that you'll never sit in its shade, but we don't seem terribly keen on that, unfortunately.
Oh, true. Oh, true. Next slide, Tarek. Next slide.
This one is is from YouGov in the UK, and it basically shows that a majority of the British voting public would support. When I say a majority, I mean it's a majority of people who actually have an opinion, and who didn't say they don't know. They want not only not only no migration, but requiring and I quote, large numbers of migrants who came to the UK in recent years to leave. Now, for a society that has had, sort of, I would say, moderate levels of migration up until I would say probably the 2000s, this is, just an astounding destruction of support for migration within British society. And I just think it's a warning This has also happened in Canada, admittedly not to the same degree, but it has happened, where ironically, I might add, a majority of migrants would prefer a massive reduction in migration. And I think probably the most ironic one is, despite the sort of perceptions and narratives surrounding race, the people who were not white had the highest level had a higher level of opposition to high migration than white Canadians. So I just think that the sort of consensus on migration in the Anglosphere has just been decimated by just poorly targeted migration, an intake that's too large, and just no real planning or forethought on it by policymakers.
No, well, in the UK, of course, we've still got very high numbers of people coming in the small boats across from France. It's a record year this year. And that they've just done a deal to try and actually send a few of them back to France. And basically, if you come illegally, they'll try and push you back, but they will take somebody who's in France who hasn't tried to come over illegally instead. So it's sort of a swappies rather than actually a reduction. And the numbers of migrants coming into the UK over the last few years has been extremely high. One of the, again, the reasons why rents are very high and why housing is a serious issue. So this is a big movement. And, you see it wherever you go that people are saying, we've had enough. We really have had enough about this. This is actually not good policy. And, we can't support ever increasing population because the health service is not up to it. The road transport network isn't up to it. And unemployment is still, rather higher than people would like to see. But, this is a big change in the weather. And you wonder where this is going to lead to. And specifically, of course, whether those people who came will actually decide to leave. And that could be quite interesting as well. I don't know. It's a fascinating conundrum because the economic conditions inside the UK and in other countries too continue to deteriorate.
Indeed, and I mean there was a poll the other day. I mean, obviously it's still like four years till the next UK election, assuming the Starmer government goes to a full term. But the latest polling modelling showed the other day that the Reform Party is in a position where they would form majority government if an election were to be held tomorrow, and that is just for a party that's just an upstart and very much and people can feel free to disagree, but very much a sort of protest vote party at the core, to be able to be delivered into power with a majority if there were to be an election is just it's just a striking sequence of events. And I mean, to be completely honest with you, I don't think that the Reform Party's the answer, because I don't think that they have the policies. I don't think they have the depth necessary. I mean, hopefully that changes before the next election, but they don't currently have the depth to be able to address these problems in a swift and effective way yet. Some of the messages are very effective. They're very appealing for a lot of frustrated British voters. But I think that they very much need to build a policy book of effective things that they could action day one, provided they end up in a position of power, than, sort of continuing to solely capitalize on the frustration of British voters.
Yes, well, there's a policy-free zone pretty much, other than a few slogans. But interestingly, their first outing will be in Wales, because traditionally in Wales, a lot of people in Wales have voted for the Welsh Independent Party, but that seems to be changing now. And in fact, it looks to me as though it could possibly be, I think it's a year or so that the next election is coming. It could be their first test as to whether that voice, the voice of protest, swings in a different direction. And if it does, that could actually be quite significant, not least because the Conservative side of politics here is absolutely on the nose after the last election already. And there are some people defecting from the Conservative side of politics to that other party over there that nobody wants to really talk about too much, but it's really booming. It's quite amazing. And so, yeah, the face of politics could change, but it's a policy-free zone, and that's the most amazing thing.
I think to me, it sort of feels a little bit like Greece during the 2010s, Britain, because Greece during the 2010s went through this phase where basically the traditional two-party divide, the left and right, they kicked them to the curb. They said no, and then they ended up with basically people who are characterized as the far left in power. And then you also saw the rise of right-wing groups like the Golden Dawn and the like, gaining ground in Parliament as well. So I feel like there's that sort of want for just something else,
Yes.
something not red, not something not blue, just something different. Because I think people are just frustrated, and I think that there's just a little bit of, for deep, deep want of a better word, just desperation creeping in that they want change. And I don't think that either side, traditional side of British politics, is in any way equipped to provide that change.
No, and I think there's an echo there in Australia too. People do want change, but they don't necessarily see that either of the major parties is going to bring that change. But nevertheless, what are the alternatives? And the alternatives don't look that flash either. So yeah, people are desperate, and sometimes it's that cardboard cutout, right? I know what I don't want, but I don't know what I do want, which is actually really part of the question, and therefore, a policy vacuum can quite early, come out quite early, and people still perhaps say, well, it's better than them over there or them over there, but and what are you voting for? Not quite sure.
Yeah, no, I concur. Now, this is an interesting one because there's been a lot of discussion about the impact of AI on the labor market, on AI on the economy. But one thing that's really, really interesting is that currently the growth stemming from investment in AI infrastructure, so processing equipment and software, is driving a larger proportion of US quarterly GDP growth than household consumption. And that's the chart there on the left. And on the right there, which is ironically enough not counted in the chart on the left, is spending on the actual construction of data centers. Now, this isn't of the actual things contained inside the data centers, this is of the actual structure itself. And that has absolutely skyrocketed towards from the second half of 2022 onwards. So even though AI, whatever may come in the future, it is playing a significant role in supporting US economic growth in the here and now, just from the very genesis of its existence.
Yeah, this is fascinating because I made a show on this the other day. If you look at the US stock market, for example, you've got these contentions of two things: the momentum around AI, where there's this massive investment, significantly positive returns recently, and more expected, is supporting the S&P 500. Unlike in Australia, we did ASX is sort of mostly mining and banks and what have you. In the US, it's a few tech stocks. But if you look at the top three tech stocks, it's more than 20% now of the total value of the S&P 500. That's the first point. The second is, of course, that the AI story is now starting to play out with job losses in some areas. And Amazon announced they're going to actually, use robots and things rather than the people in some of their distribution centers. And so there's now a bit of a speculation about how does this play out in terms of jobs, and will there be jobs and what sort of jobs? But you've got this massive swing in terms of the investment in the infrastructure, more energy, of course, required, more water required for the data centers. And so you've got this sort of slurping sound. More and more of the economy is being consumed by the AI monster. Question is, what's left?
I think that's going to be the question of our time, for years, if not potentially over a decade to come, because no one really knows how this is all going to play out or how this is all going to end. I mean, someone the other day, I forget who it was, but they basically put forward the theory that AI was going to play out in a similar way as railways did during the Industrial Revolution in the US, that basically it's going to revolutionize things enormously, but it's not necessarily going to be very profitable for the people actually providing the underlying infrastructure. Like, if you actually look at, there's a really, really fascinating chart from the US Federal Reserve of the price of railway stocks right? So this is the actual companies, the stocks of the companies building the railways in the US and providing with people with transport. And basically, I believe if I'm remembering correctly, that around about they sort of almost peaked in the 1840s, and that peak wasn't recovered again until I think it was the 1880s. And during that time, if you look at a map of the US rail network expanding, dramatically over that period, just this absolutely gargantuan expansion, this explosion in industrialized transportation, which was brilliant for the economy in aggregate. But as I said, it didn't end up making the people revolutionizing things a whole lot of money in the end. And I do wonder if that's going to happen with AI this time, particularly because you are having a lot of different nations pursuing their own different options. And there's always going to be someone trying to come in and undercut if it is something that is going to be so pivotal to everyday life. So it's going to be very interesting. And then there's obviously the labor market side of things, and oh, I don't know. I don't know where that one's going, to be completely honest with you.
No, it's interesting. The latest Chat GDP that's just come out, of course, they've got a free tier there, and they're now sort of offering it to more people. And I'm thinking, well, that's interesting because the original pricing was quite aggressive, and you can still get subscription services and what have you, and get faster responses. But the idea of actually spreading it out and making some of it free suggests that maybe there is a bit of a tipping point here. And as you say, you wonder what the forward trajectory is. Of course, the real story here is the early adopters can quite often make a lot of money initially. But again, if you look at the rail system and the way that that's now developed, over the 100 years plus, it hasn't really quite played out. And neither, by the way, has the rail system been that revolutionary thing now that people thought it was. And in many areas, they took the tracks up again later. So it is fascinating. But we're in another boom, and some people are calling it a similar path to the year 2000 dot-com bubble. Others are saying, no, this is fundamentally different because of what you can do with the AI. I'm still waiting to see how this plays out in detail. But I do think that the AI removal of a lot of clerical jobs and middle tier jobs is coming. So effectively, this is potentially going to be negative to quite large proportions of the population in terms of their current employment.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, and I think that part of the problem is that part of it comes down to what lens you're assessing the impact with. Because I think that there's this idea that, oh, it's going to make 20, 25, 30, 40% of unemployed people of unemployed, and that's going to be horrible and difficult and etc. But the thing is that if it only makes, let's say it makes 4, 5% of people effectively unemployable, people who lack the necessary talent and the necessary mindset to be able to retrain into a role that's going to be able to get them gainful employment in the age of AI. Now, that's not a lot. That's not a large proportion of workers. You're literally talking, 1 in 20 at the most. If those people effectively become unemployable, the attitude towards welfare at a political level is going to shift overnight. You saw that during COVID. When the government thought there was going to be mass unemployment, they just thought, oh crap, people are going to realize just how badly people on unemployment benefits have to live. We better double it. We got to do something. Otherwise, there's going to be riots in the streets. Like that was sort of the perception at the time. And I think if all of a sudden instead of having 900,000 or a million, I think it's little over a million people at the moment, or 1.05 million people on various unemployment benefits. If that all of a sudden rises by another 5% of the labor force, so what, another 700, 800,000 people, the government's going to have problems. They're going to have a problem in terms of how are these people going to vote? Once Liberal vote, once Labor voters all of a sudden, and the Greens turn around and they're going to go, well, we're going to do this for you. Or One Nation says, we're going to do this for all the people who are hard hit by AI. All of a sudden, all these different parties providing a different alternative to desperate people is going to start looking pretty damn appealing. But then there's also the fiscal side of things. How are you going to fund an extra 700,000 people on unemployment benefits? And not only that, but how are you then? Are those people then going to demand significantly greater levels of support? Is all of a sudden the calls of St Vincent de Paul or the Australian Council of Social Services, those particular calls going to all of a sudden sound a whole lot more appealing to a lot more people, forcing the government to spend additional money? And what knock-on effects does that have? So there's a lot of moving parts there going on, and I think it could really get quite difficult with only a relatively small proportion of the workforce being impacted.
Yeah, and I've had this view for some time that the universal basic income philosophy is something which we may see more of. In other words, because there isn't jobs for everybody in the future, maybe governments will have to actually just hand out money up to a certain level, and it can change the structure of society. So we don't know how it's going to play out, but I do think that the hype around AI is probably peak hype at the moment, and I'm always thinking that. If I think of the internet, I was around in the 90s and was very much thinking about some of these evolutionary forces for the internet. And I always said the short-term impacts are probably overhyped. The long-term impacts potentially are actually underhyped. And if you stand back from the perspective now, well, the internet's everywhere and it's just part of the way we do things, it's probably going to be similar. But I think the fiscal, financial, and social consequences are probably ones that should be thought through.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that, to be completely honest with you, I don't think that they're going to be thought through by policymakers. I think
Oh,
that
really?
I, I think that,
Surprise me.
yeah, I think it's more likely that they're going to be slapped in the face with it and then
Yeah,
forced into
correct.
whatever action is they feel is necessary at the time.
Yeah, reactive rather than proactive again.
Yeah, exactly. Now, I've been looking for the data for this particular chart for a while. Now, this is based on data from the US government and, well, US Energy Authority, I believe. Anyway, this charts the course of overall coal production. So this is both thermal and metallurgical coal in Australia, China, and India since 1980. Now, as you can see there, China has undergone absolutely meteoric rise. And honestly, India's rise would look pretty meteoric too if there wasn't China on the chart. And it's also just worth noting that earlier this year, the Indian government's Ministry of Coal announced that India would be increasing its production on 2024 levels by over 500,000,000 tons, which is approximately an Australia and then some.
Yeah, well, that puts net zero into a different light, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that that's sort of part of the problem. And I mean, I've always been of the view that the developing world was going to pursue the most cost-effective and accessible route to industrialization because that's the logical thing for them to do. And for a country like India that does have a lot of thermal coal, that does see the issues with building a energy network on foundations that require imports of gas, etc., or oil, if they can build it on something that they can access domestically and access domestically on a large scale, then that's obviously going to be what they prefer because that has generally been what India has tried to do. They've very much tried to be self-sufficient and India for India. And you can't really begrudge them that, but I think it does complicate the sort of overall emissions reductions when you are seeing India and China continue to build coal-fired power capacity, even as other nations such as Australia, Europe, the US, Japan pull back on coal-fired capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in the UK, of course, they have stopped using coal and blew up all the power stations to make sure they couldn't use them again.
Is that's what so basically they thought about it. They thought, what would Stalin do? And if it was being invaded, and they went full scorched earth.
Exactly. Exactly right.
That
It's amazing.
I yeah I It's a very complex issue, I understand, but I mean, I think it's challenging when you look at a chart like this and you think, sheesh,
Hmm.
that, say for example, India is going to add another 500 million tons worth of coal capacity in the next 5 years alone. And, then you think forward to the future. You think, well, what's it going to look like later on in the century when you start to see Africa hitting where China and India were a decade ago, or they are now? Particularly some of the more populous, more perhaps more affluent by sub-Saharan African standards, so places like Nigeria, which still, which have significant oil reserves. You know, uh, you could see them pursuing, say, for example, using the gas that they get from their oil wells to power their future. So it's a very, very complex picture, and it's all well and good for to go talk to governments in sub-Saharan Africa today and say, oh, hey, well, this country signed up to net zero, or they signed up to this particular climate agreement, but that doesn't really matter all that much when they don't really have the means to break the agreement, even if they wanted to. But if you're talking about in 20 years, people looking to pursue the best course of action for their nation, that could be different. I mean, naturally, 20 years is a long time. There could be different advances in technologies, different advances in renewables, but they may look at things and think, well, what can we do domestically? What do we have domestically? And that could be coal, that could be gas. So it's just going to depend on how things play out. Because at the end of the day, people can make all sorts of agreements, but it's pragmatism that wins the day.
Yeah, and just Trump, of course, and net zero. Well, two different polars, aren't they?
Well, there's definitely there's that, isn't there? Just pursuing a very different course of action, but
Hmm.
it's just one of those things. I mean, although to be honest, I'm really just going to be curious to see how net zero fares in Europe
Yes,
as the challenges continue to emerge from the cost of industrial power. And when I say industrial power, I don't mean actual industrial power in terms of like building stuff. I mean in terms of powering industry with the cost of electricity. So it's going to be interesting.
I agree. Yes, nothing yet concluded. I think it's going to be a very bumpy ride.
Indeed. Now, this is an interesting one that's flown under the radar for the most part. And this is from on the left there. We've got a tweet from Chris Balding, who's a expert on China, a former professor, and very, very smart, very, very smart guy. And basically, he's saying, look at the Chinese social security funds, because basically they don't have the money to be able to actually pay out their obligations. Now, on the right there's a tweet from a professor, Henry Gao, and he's saying that one of the big issues going forward is how a ruling in China's Supreme Court will be relating to the issue of social security, of these contributions by individuals and by businesses. Now, I realize this is somewhat esoteric and a bit abstract, but it's actually surprisingly vital. And I'm just going to read a little bit of it here. And early in late July, the Chinese Supreme Court released their interpretation. It's going to be basically be summed up in layman's terms as: an employee and an employer cannot legally agree to skip paying social security contributions. Any such agreement is invalid. If the employer does not pay social security and the employee quits their position as a result, the court will support the employee's right to compensation. Now, the problem is that only 28% of Chinese firms, 28% of Chinese businesses are actually paying their social security contributions in full. And part of the problem with that is that basically the way that the law is currently written is, in some cases, the social security contributions are larger than the required contributions are larger than people's wages. So basically, you've got this issue whereby the Chinese social security funds have not been paid the money that they need to. And now the Chinese Supreme Court's turn around and basically saying, if this ends up, getting through without any issues and interference by the Chinese government, that these businesses need to start paying these contributions and start supporting the system. I imagine because they're afraid of what's going to happen to the pension system if they don't. And Professor Gao concludes that if that ends up being the case, the survivors of this particular shift will slash hiring, unemployment will surge, domestic consumption will weaken further, deflation will deepen, and it will push the economy into an even steeper downward spiral. And he warns his readers to buckle up and that the worst is yet to come.
As a sleeping issue, that's amazing. And when you think about the long-term consequences of that, you've got to say, wow.
Yeah, I was, sort of peripherally aware of it. It was on the radar, but I didn't realize that it was so underfunded to such a significant degree on such a huge scale. And I think the problem is that there is no easy answer to this. If you turn around and you say, even if you fix the contribution issue, if you say to people, you need to pay, these 70 odd percent of companies that haven't paid their contributions in full, you say to them, no, you need to pay, even at a reduced, more reasonable rate. That is going to cost a shed load of money, and as Professor Gao mentions, create some very serious issues. But then on the other hand, if they turn around and then they don't pay, then the Chinese social security funds don't have enough money to fund pensions, and the Chinese pension age is still a very generous 60 years of age. So what do? Do you turn around and say to people, well, you're going to have to work to 65 or 67 as they have to here in Australia? Or does the system collapse, or do they print more money? Or there's a whole host of potential outcomes there, none of which are good.
Print more money, I'm sure, is part of the answer. The global government printers are just going burr 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 at the moment.
I'm a little bit more sort of uncertain on this one, because the Chinese government, if there's one thing that they are afraid of, it's inflation. Because one of the kind of forgotten things about the Chinese Civil War is a lot of people think that it was just like, oh, well, the communists just overpowered the nationalists and that was it, and it was just all done by force of arms. Yes, obviously that is what happened in terms of the overall issue, but part of the why is that after World War II, there was enormous levels of inflation in China, and that helped to destroy what was left of the support held by the nationalist Chinese. And for people to turn around and go, well, you know what? Inflation has already destroyed my wealth. It's destroyed my savings. It's destroyed my livelihood. Maybe the communists are a better alternative. And at the time, the communists were pursuing, a sort of fairly aggressive policy of inclusion, sort of promoting education, promoting workers' rights, promoting the rights of women. So at the time, it was a pretty appealing sort of prospect. So I think that they're very much aware in China of the threat of inflation. And I think that's why they've been so reticent to pursue consumer-focused inflation, lest they potentially unleash the inflation monster. So it's going to be a very, very interesting one.
Yeah, well, we'll watch with interest. But the M3 in China is growing as quite fast as it is in the US, as it in Europe, as in Australia. Everywhere you go, the M3 is getting bigger. In other words, the amount of money in circulation, which is an inflationary force.
It certainly is. I mean, it's mostly contained into the Chinese financial system for the moment. But yes, absolutely. If that gets out, then definitely. And I will just note that for the Bitcoiners and the crypto folks who are watching, that growth in the Chinese money supply has played a significant role in the growth of global liquidity, which has helped to underpin the rise in crypto prices over the last 18 months in particular.
And gold as well.
Yep.
Yeah, it's all part of the same process. And so the everything bubble, because it's chasing stock values higher, it's chasing Bitcoin prices higher and other cryptos and gold. Global liquidities continue to grow, and that's one of the reasons.
Exactly right. Now, this is our last chart of the day. I got the data for this from the Kaiser Family Foundation and the US Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this shows US health insurance premiums for workers cumulatively since 1999 till 2022 against cumulative CPI growth. And I think this just reveals why so many Americans are so pissed off about the cost of living. Because something so very, very basic like healthcare and the cost at the for the user has risen by such an enormous amount, but the CPI just isn't capturing that. And I think it's perfectly understandable why a lot of Americans are unhappy and why they're turning away from the more traditional political alternatives.
Well, it comes right back to where we came in. What is the real data telling versus what the official data is saying, and healthcare costs rising. By the way, healthcare costs are rising in Australia very significantly too, and those are not necessarily tracked very well in the Australian data either. So it is a big deal, and some of that's to do with costs of pharmaceuticals, of course, but also some of it to do with labour costs. But that's a huge impost on many households. And we come right back to where we came in. Well, a lot of households are not feeling the love in terms of the economy. A lot of households are feeling as though they've gone backwards. And in fact, all the data says, actually, you have.
Yeah, exactly. Because this hasn't been measured in the US CPI in anything like the same way,
Yeah.
because they measure it using health insurer profits, because that's the way you should do it for some bizarre reason. And because of the way it functions, it's actually lower now than it was a couple of years ago. And of course, Americans are looking at that and going, "What are you talking about? That's not been my experience at all." So it's very much a mess, and I think that's why I think that if you look at some of these metrics and you sort of just even add a little bit, even 0.5% or 0.75% onto the annual CPI, and then you put that through the old calculator and then calculate real incomes, real disposable incomes, all that sort of stuff. All of a sudden, it starts looking pretty sick for households. And well, geez, if you start including housing costs as they are, rather than just rents and the owner's estimates of rents for people who do own properties, that's a pretty ugly looking sort of set of numbers. So I think it's very clear why people are struggling and why people are frustrated.
Yeah, and just quickly, the point here, of course, is one of it is measuring the incremental growth, but the other is what is the absolute amount that people are paying. And remember that inflation, the CPI, is measuring change. One of the things I do in my surveys is look at the actual real numbers. So what is the real dollar value that people are paying? And that gives you a much better view of what households are really experiencing, because, of course, real dollars go out the door rather than actually it's 5% higher than last year. That's sort of just an incremental measure. And that, for me, is the critical problem with a lot of the data that we've got. We are at a high plateau in costs, and that high plateau of costs, month on month on month, is sucking more and more out of households' budgets. And with wages growth still relatively anemic, with a lot of cost pressure still in the system, this is going to continue to be the big pressure. But nobody really wants to talk about it, other than on this show, of course.
Well, I think it brings us back to what you were saying before about at the start of the show about the fact that people are still seeing rises in rents of 10 to 15% due to the lagged effect of rental increases, which is, to be completely honest with you, looking at the numbers from SQM, looking at the numbers from PropTrack, etc., is about what I think you'd expect to see a narrowing between the CPI and between the actual asking rents. But that's not what we're seeing in the data. Although I will say one thing is, if somehow your data was to replace rents in the CPI, it would all of a sudden, any chances of rate cuts would start to look quite a lot more scant.
Yes, I fear that if people started using my data and put that into the official statistics, it would blow the Martin model, that's the one the RBA uses, out of the water. So you have to have Martin Mark II.
Well, well, that would work. I mean, they don't even need to change the name. They can literally just.
Absolutely. Well, there you go. So it's obviously set up. So RBA, if you're interested, just give me a call. I'm very happy to help. Links are below. Tarek, great conversation, and as always, we know we go into areas here which probably nobody else does, but this is really, really important stuff, and I think we can draw some very important conclusions from it. So, thank you as always for all the work. We'll put your links and things below, and we'll put Tarek's YouTube channel down there as well. He'll probably clip some of this too as to short posts, which is great. And we must do it again because there's always plenty to explore on these sorts of shows. Thank you, Tarek. Really appreciate it.
No worries, mate. Thanks for having me.
Take care. See you soon.